Hi there, everyone. My name is Gina McGinn. I am the board co-chair of the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation. I am so pleased to welcome you to this event today called Amplifying Community Impact Forever. As we gather here virtually today, we would like to acknowledge our presence on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, the original lands of the Cree, Dene, Ojibwa, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis. Our guest speaker today is joining us from Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Acknowledging our land is respectful of the relationships we have and honors the authentic history of our country and its original people. So over the past year and a half, we have been getting a lot more used to these virtual events, though we do know that sometimes we can have some technical difficulties. So if you do require any sort of technical support, please don't hesitate to reach out to Kayla, and she will gladly help you. Her contact information is at the bottom of your screen underneath the chat box. So this event is being recorded, and it will be available after the event upon request. And the question and answer section at the end of our event will not be recorded, just mainly to uphold privacy legislation and rules. So before we move into the presentation, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge and remember Murray Grant. Murray was one of the founding members with the foundation, and he just passed away last week. He will be greatly missed by everyone with the foundation and the greater community of Southern Saskatchewan. We have with us today Donna Ziegler, who is our Executive Director of the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation, and Rick Frost, retired CEO of the Winnipeg Foundation, is our guest speaker today. I would certainly like to thank everyone who's taken the time to join us today, and we are super excited to try this new virtual platform for an event like this. Our agenda today includes the keynote presentation by Rick Frost. Then we're going to move into a history of the SSCF with Donna Ziegler. Then we're going to move into an armchair discussion with both Donna and Rick. And then Donna's going to speak to us about the future of the SSCF. We're going to close off with that question and answer period. So start to think about, as the presentation moves forward, about some of the things you might want to ask us. I'd like to introduce you all to Rick Frost. Rick served as CEO of the Winnipeg Foundation from 1997 until 2021. During this time, he steered the foundation through unprecedented growth and change. And Rick just retired on April 26th of this year at the Foundation's 100th anniversary. He is passionate about the charitable sector, and he particularly enjoyed working on the Foundation's leadership initiatives such as Downtown Green Spaces, Nourishing Potential, Literacy for Life, and the Centennial Institute. In recognition of his contributions to community, Rick was recently inducted into the Order of Manitoba. He holds an MA in History from McMaster University, an MPA from Queen's University, and honorary doctorates of law from both the University of Winnipeg and the University of Manitoba. So today, Rick is going to reflect back on 23 years of building a more impactful community foundation. In 1997, the Winnipeg Foundation granted $5 million to community organizations and had assets of approximately $80 million. By the end of 2020, they granted $73 million with assets of approximately $1.6 billion. This growth is the result of long-term partnerships fueled by collaboration with donors. It provides incredible impact on the community that will grow each year forever. Rick will take us on a journey of this growth and show donors how you can continue to make an even bigger impact in your community. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Rick to the forum with us, and if everyone else could give him a virtual wave or welcome, please go ahead and do so. So over to you, Rick.
Well, thank you very much, Gina. That's a very kind introduction, and it's a great pleasure for me to be able to join your organization today for your meeting with donors. We've got a long relationship with Regina and Saskatchewan Moose Jaw because the Moffat Family Fund makes an annual gift into there from the Winnipeg Foundation. So we've got a long relationship, and of course, collegial relationships between Manitoba and Saskatchewan are very strong in any case because just the natural geography, I suppose, or the similarities between our two provinces. I'm going to walk through a series of slides that I prepared back in June when this meeting was originally scheduled. So I'm just going to walk through those. But obviously, I'm here to talk as I reflect on 100 years of Winnipeg Foundation's history, but also talk about some of the more recent things that have sort of impacted our success. The slides, I don't know if someone can put those up, or maybe we can just start there and maybe flip to the first one. The next one, please. Just waiting for the technology to catch up. There's a general number of topics I'm going to cover. I'm not going to go through each of them here, but I'll talk about it a bit. But the first point I want to make is that if you've seen one community foundation, you've seen one community foundation. We are all different. Our value base is the same. Obviously, our community building goals are the same. Doesn't matter whether you're serving South Saskatchewan or Winnipeg or Manitoba or wherever you might be. We're all committed to building our communities. But how we do it can be quite different. And that's because our communities are different and you have to more or less adapt the structure of a community foundation to suit your circumstances. And fortunately, community foundations are quite flexible in the way they're structured. I'll turn to the next slide and just get started. This slide is a picture, obviously, of a downtown scene in Winnipeg, which some of you may be familiar with. It's the Alloway Arch and the Widow's Mite Fountain. Mr. Alloway, a banker in 1921, made a gift of $100,000 to create the Winnipeg Foundation. Now, $100,000 today is a lot of money, but back in 1921, $100,000 was even more in terms of its value. And his stipulation was that you can't spend the capital. You can only spend the interest that was earned on the capital. So in 1922, we made 6,000 financial structure of how an endowment works. The second gift is represented by the fountain in the front of this picture, the Widow's Mite Fountain, because in 1924, the Winnipeg Foundation got its second gift, $15, three gold coins in an envelope, which they still have in the envelope and still have in the office, rather. And it more or less represents the mix of contributions that are going to build the community foundation. Mr. Alloway with his $100,000 wonderful startup gift, but then the Widow's Mite, just as important, $15 to say, this is not just going to be for wealthy people. A community foundation is going to be for everybody. And that's the philosophy that sort of built the Winnipeg Foundation. An idea of pooling your resources. And that's what this pool kind of represents. There's three water spouts there representing three gold coins. And as I say, the idea of pooling resources at this particular site. It's also interesting, not to belabor the point, but I found these shards, the makeup of the Alloway Arch in a city yard in 1998, and it took 20 years before we got this area built in downtown Winnipeg, but it is sort of commemorate the founding of the Winnipeg Foundation. The next slide, I think, is just a simple statement that talks about the importance of of sort of pooling gifts. But actually, I see I've got this one in first. So I'll talk about this. This slide is it's sort of a stage play at the Manitoba Theatre Centre. All communities have theater and different types of stage plays going on, but this is the Manitoba Theatre Centre, and it's worth sort of telling this story. It's sort of a poster child for us, because back in about 2001, 2002, the theater came to the foundation and said, we want to partner, we want to build a new endowment. And they had $13,600. And so we started there, and they started there. There were gifts coming in every year. When they were really pushing the idea of making gifts, we were getting as many as 700 gifts a year into this particular fund. As in all funds at the Winnipeg Foundation, the median gift is $100. So when we say we got 700 gifts, 350 of those gifts would be $100 or less. But then there would always be the larger gifts that build funds, obviously in a more significant way. Today, this fund is worth about $25 million. It generates well over $1 million a year for the theater. And it is a significant source of revenue for that particular organization. It's one example of an endowment that sort of started in a very modest way, that was built with literally hundreds and hundreds of modest gifts and some more significant gifts. And in the end, it's now the most significant single source of revenue for the Manitoba Theatre Centre. Someone asked me, is it transformational? It took 20 years to build this fund, obviously, and we know with an endowment building that's always the case. And I think it is transformational in terms of giving the theater a real source of continuing sustained revenue. And now we come to the next slide, comes to that statement that I was referring to earlier, talking about the widow's mite and the idea of pooling resources. And I think that this is the fundamental philosophy that's behind the success of the Winnipeg Foundation. That's not the size of the gift, but the giving that counts. And that's what we have emphasized during my 23 years and before that, before I got there. But it's always been the philosophy of the foundation, not to worry about the size of gifts, but the idea of pooling resources for the betterment of our community. People from all walks of life building the foundation. The next slide speaks to some of the attributes of building a foundation. And obviously, one of the most important things from my perspective is to focus on endowments. All foundations will have flow-through gifts. People want to make a gift and they want to immediately go into the community. But I believe in building long-term relationships. I think that that's fundamental to the success, which means you have to be very patient. In today's world, everyone is in a hurry. They want to see impact immediately. They want to demonstrate leadership and all those kinds of good things, all very important. But in the endowment building business, I'm afraid you have to be pretty patient. You make a gift today, it gets invested, and it generates wealth into the future. And when they talk about our grants going from $6,000 in 1922 to going to $73 million last year, you can see we have been patient, but it is paying off in big time in terms of the contributions back to the community. One of the fundamental issues for any endowment donor, I suppose, is sort of an acceptance that you're going to be helping people that you probably will never know, because it's all about building a better community well into the future. Someone has asked me many times, I've said, we're not going to have financial quotas. We're not going to sort of set financial targets. We're going to be more focused on building the donor base. And someone said, well, what do you count? Because in management, we all know, if you're in management, you know that what gets counted counts. And I've always said, count the number of donors, count the number of unique donors that we've had in the course of a year. I remember when we started, we probably had, I would guess, about 200 unique donors in the course of a year. Last year, we were about 10,000 unique donors coming into the Winnipeg Foundation. So, you build the donor base, and then the dollars sort of follow. So the most important to focus in on the relationship side. And if you're doing any fundraising, it has to be strategic. We'll talk to that on the next slide. The next slide, if you will switch to it, is picking up just a couple of kids, obviously, and I want to talk a bit about nourishing potential. It's one of the projects that we worked on, sort of an example of the kind of work that the Winnipeg Foundation does. Back in 2011, we knew that feeding kids was important. There were a lot of programs in the city, but where were the gaps is really what we're kind of interested in. And we met in 2 meetings with youth serving organizations, and they identified that after-school programming was an issue in terms of feeding kids. Every kid comes out of school 3:30, they're hungry, and it's hard to get their attention on whatever it might be it a sport activity or computers lessons or whatever it might be. It's hard to get their attention if they're hungry. So we decided to build what we called the Nourishing Potential Fund. And again, it was asking people from all walks of life to contribute to building this new endowment. And we were fortunate. The city of Winnipeg, for example, was was a sponsor. One of our lead sponsors gave us $250,000 toward the building of this fund, but we had other donors as well and other companies that joined in. And in the end, we ended up with an endowment of $6 million. It generates about $300,000 a year. And the biggest grant you can get from the Nourishing Potential Fund is $10,000. So that's a limit that we set on it. So we know that we're going to be granting, to 30 or 40 youth-serving organizations every year to support their after-school programs to make sure that there's adequate food, better food, and obviously maybe some nutrition lessons along the way. So it's an example of sort of strategic fundraising, but the idea that everyone can contribute. And again, this is a good example of hundreds of gifts coming into a single fund, and the median gift, again, being about $100, even though the total amount ended up being close to $6 million. The next slide speaks to the importance of partnerships. I think it's critical that a community foundation look for partnerships because we are in the long-term business. The Winnipeg Foundation has literally hundreds of relationships with organizations. Every year we had an agency fund breakfast where we invited groups, just sort of told them what the foundation is doing, our financial results, obviously, and those kinds of things, but to encourage them to have an interest in their endowment, because most organizations, in my experience, are desperate for money day to day. There's a lot of pressure, especially today, on charitable organizations. And success in endowment building is a long-term game. You have to be willing to put dollars in today, recognizing that it's going to be sustainable money coming out for many years to come. So if you're getting 50 gifts a year to an agency fund for the local library or the local art theater program or whatever it might be, that's a significant number of gifts, and that will slowly build that fund and make a huge difference in the long run. Remember, one executive director said to me early on in my time at the Winnipeg Foundation, we're talking about putting an agency fund in place for his organization, and he said to me, "You're asking me to do all this work for the next guy." And I said, "You've got the idea. That's exactly what we're doing. We're building these funds for the next guy." And that's what sustainable revenue is all about, and that's what, in my view, Community Foundation is about. The next slide is a picture of Elizabeth Alloway. She is obviously the wife of our founder. In many ways, we always say that, I'm sure around the kitchen table, she was part of the decision-making that led to the creation of Canada's first community foundation here in Winnipeg. But the important thing about her, and in our history at least, is that she was the first person who made a gift, a bequest in her will to the foundation. And in 1926, when she died, we received a bequest from her. And it was discretionary. In other words, any money we earned off that bequest, we could spend however we wished. And I think that's one of the most important things about wills and contributions in wills, is that most people, through their will, are less likely to make restrictions on it, and that gives the foundation more capacity to respond to community grant applications. So obviously, discretionary funds are very important. At the Winnipeg Foundation, we have a legacy circle where once a year we bring all the donors together who are prospective donors, at least people who have promised something in their will. We don't know what they've promised in their will, of course, unless they volunteer to tell us. But we bring them together, and again, we have a program. We tell them about the foundation, the work the foundation's, the projects we're working on, and that sort of thing, basically so that they feel a contact with the organization that eventually their will provide some resources to and continue to grow our organization. I remember back at least 10 or more years ago now, I visited a community called Pilot Mound, which some of you may have heard of in Saskatchewan, but it's a very small community here in Manitoba. And we have a fund for Pilot Mound at the foundation. And at the time, it had $90,000 in it, and it was celebrating its 10th anniversary. And I remember going there, and there was a birthday cake. There's probably 50 or 60 people in the room. And they were sort of gathered around and celebrating this idea that they had 10 years of history with their fund, and how pleased they were that it had reached $90,000 and it was now generating probably about $4,500 a year in grants. And they were giving out $500 grants, the personal care home or to the library, that sort of thing. And I remember the smile that came across my face, and I'm sure the bigger smile that came across their face, was probably 6 or 7 years later. Someone left them a gift, a bequest of over $1 million. So that small community of 500 or 600 people suddenly had an endowment fund, endowment related to their community, not just of 90,000, but of well in excess of $1 million, obviously generating a lot more capacity in their community. In the next slide, I sort of try to make a bit of a crosswalk between this idea of designated funds, because most donors today want to designate their gifts to either a specific charity or sometimes a specific cause, something that's close to their heart, a scholarship perhaps in memory of a loved one, something like that. Donor's choice is obviously the most important thing to respect, and I think that that's at the root of any successful organization, is to respect what donors want to do. We have tried at the Winnipeg Foundation to find bridges between sort of the specific goals of a donor and sort of the general causes that the community is looking for support, because obviously the community's making grant applications to their local community foundation and they're looking for grant support. So we try to find a bridge between those two, and we've designed these 6 causes to sort of promote that. But another way of coming at it, it was mentioned in the introduction, my affection or passion about the Literacy for Life Fund. It's another example of a fund that basically provides $4,000 grants to mums and tots reading courses or reading programs, I guess you'd call it, in church basements or library basements, those kinds of things. And about half the grants are spent in Winnipeg and half the grants outside of Winnipeg, so across Manitoba. Grants of up to $4,000. Again, we started off with nothing in the fund. We built it up to a $3 million fund approximately. It generates maybe $150,000 a year, $4,000 at a time, going into pay for, a teacher, some snacks, some books. So someone can have a 8 or 10 week Thursday morning mums and tots reading program. So it's a people know what they're donating to on the one hand, which sort of satisfies the donor, but on the other hand, it gives the foundation discretion to respond to applications which may be coming from different churches or different community organizations that want to do programming. So trying to find that balance between discretion and donor direction. The next slide speaks again a little more specifically to donor choice, because this is so fundamental to success in sort of appreciating that donors want to help the community. They're interested in the long run sustainable gifts, and we're trying to always try to find the balance of how do we satisfy the donor's desire on the one hand and also respond to the community applications on the other. And so it's this issue of discretion, but any gift, no matter what it is, to the community foundation adds to capacity to the foundation, allows it, because there's a fee attached to any fund, allows it to, pay the rent, pay the staff, and all those kinds of things that you need to do to run an organization. So this is the balancing act that community foundations are working with, and many organizations today are heavily involved in donor-advised funds. Because you get that balance gain where you're working with the donor and saying, here's what the applications we're receiving, and the donor is able to say, well, I like that one, or I don't like that one, or whatever it might be. And working together in partnership, you can sort of support the community in ways that are meaningful to both the community and to the donor. I mentioned the Legacy Circle again because it's an important tool in terms of education and communication between the foundation and donors. I wanted to just talk for a second about Endow Manitoba on the next slide, because I know Saskatchewan and Manitoba are very similar. Obviously, we've got one big city, Winnipeg, and then a whole number of smaller communities, whereas I think you're a little bit more diversified in having larger and smaller cities and towns and communities. But we have worked hard in Manitoba to build a strong community foundation sort of base for our province, and I know that that's something that would be really important in your community. As I say, we have worked with your foundation in Moose Jaw, so I know you're interested in working in right across, obviously, the south part of the province. One of the programs we had, I'll just quickly mention it. There's so many things to talk about, but we have an Endow Manitoba Challenge, which was kind of an interesting thing we set up quite a number of years ago, where the Winnipeg Foundation put up $100,000 on a 5-to-1 match and said anyone who wants to contribute to their local fund, we will contribute up to $2,000 if you can raise $10,000. Was sort of the way the plan worked. So an organization, a community that was able to raise $10,000 for their local fund could have it augmented by $2,000 that came out of the general reserves of the Winnipeg Foundation. And that program started off kind of slow. I think the first year it was a 24-hour program. So in 24 hours, we probably did $200,000 the first year. We gradually grew it. It's pretty much doing $1 million every year now in terms of contributions into funds across the province. It doesn't support Winnipeg; it supports all the other parts of the province. But it is a way of sort of everybody pooling their money, and the resources that are growing are significant. And this is a perfect example of lots and lots of gifts of $100 to $150. Very gradual process of building funds. The next slide, I'm not going to speak to in any detail at all. I just wanted to say, like any business, there's a discipline about running a community foundation. Obviously, the bigger you get, the more staff you have, the more discipline and the more sophistication that can come into the program. I think one of the great things about South Saskatchewan now, I think, is it's sort of coming into that stage where it's getting big enough that it can have more capacity to look at a lot of the sort of the nuances of how you do build a foundation. I started out lucky when I started the Winnipeg Foundation. We already had a pretty good base in place. There were 6 staff when I started. I don't know what the staff of South Saskatchewan is today, but I started with 6. When I left, we had 66. So it's a totally different ball game today, but it takes time, obviously, to build that resource. The next slide, I just touch on it because I think it is really important. Truth and Reconciliation, obviously, is in the news every night. Back in 1915, Maclean's magazine said Winnipeg was the most racist city in the country. So we've been challenged for not just the last 5 or 6 years, but going back decades of having significant challenges, race relation type challenges in our city. So building relationships has been a really important element of my work and the work that our community foundation has worked on. Relationships are obviously personal. Experiences are personal. And so you can't sort of take it from one community to another. Basically, you have to do your own work in this area. And again, I come back to what I said at the very beginning. If you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation, and we're all doing it our own way. But it is, in my opinion, probably, we've got a long way to go on this front. Obviously, our whole country has a long way to go on this front, but this is, I think, a very important strategic element to building a foundation, and something that I spent time on, and I know our foundation continues to see as a top priority. And the last slide that I'll touch on is just talking about the importance of ambassadors. I think a lot of charities focus on, how much money did they raise? Their goal this year is to raise $4 million or something like that. And my focus in 23 years at the Winnipeg Foundation was building the donor base and building ambassadors for the foundation. We needed people who could tell stories about how the foundation benefited their organization or something that touched their family in a personal way. We needed to have a diversity of leadership in different committees, and so giving your time was important. Working with agencies to support their campaigns was an important element. Obviously, you're working with professional advisors, lawyers, and accountants, and that sort of thing. next generation, trying to build knowledge in the next generation of what is philanthropy all about, and what kind of philanthropy choices do they have. I've often been asked about, people said to me, we need more givers. And I said, we need more askers. That's what we really need. Because asking for money to support a cause is way more difficult than giving to a cause. And so ambassadors for the foundation, I think, is one of the most important elements of the success of the foundation. We have been very fortunate over the years of building a base of people who kind of understand what we're trying to do with our endowment building strategy, and have supported us. And I certainly think that that same sense of generosity exists in Saskatchewan. Obviously, with what you've already accomplished, that's clearly demonstrated. And I think as I look back on my 23 years spending time working on this as my career, it's certainly the thing that I value the most, is sort of the relationship that we had with donors, and their willingness to support the strategies that we were advocating. So those are my comments. I wish you all the very best, obviously, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation, Rick. And, you're talking about building a base of ambassadors, but, thank you so much for your own ambassadorship with everything that you've done for the foundation in Manitoba, and for sharing your story with the rest of us here at this event. I was jotting down some notes of themes, and it's difficult to kind of summarize it without me kind of going on, but some key takeaways for me are that partnerships are key, and it's not just about the size of the gift that counts, rather it's about that whole pooling piece. I love the metaphor of that pool that was at the beginning of your presentation. It's such a meaningful way to describe what it is that we're all about with the pooling of funds to create that ability to endow for the future. And I liked, my last comment I'll share is about donors feeling comfortable about giving to future generations of people that they may never know. I've heard that narrative flow through in different speakers who may be aligned more with truth and reconciliation initiatives, such as Cindy Blackstock. I'm not sure if you've come across her or not, but that's a very common theme that she carries through in her delivery of what it is that she's advocating all about. So, and one last comment, uniqueness of communities, isn't that the truth? There's several of us throughout Canada, but every community is different, and that ability for those local donors to contribute to what's happening in their local community is different, and it's such a meaningful purpose that we're serving here in southern Saskatchewan. So with that, thank you again, and I'm going to turn things now over to Donna Ziegler. And so Donna has been with the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation as our Executive Director since 2018. She truly understands the importance of stewarding relationships between donors and charities, and the importance of philanthropy in building community. Donna holds a Master's of Communications degree from Royal Roads University, and she's worked in the charitable and nonprofit sectors and served also as an elected school board member for nearly 2 decades. She is a member of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, the Canadian Association of Gift Planners, International Association of Business Communicators, and the International Coach Federation. So with that, Donna and I are going to have a little bit of a switcheroo here at the stage, and it's over to you, Donna.
Thanks very much. I just want to make sure you can hear me. Thanks again, Gina, for that introduction of Rick and myself, and the information, Rick, that you shared is very inspiring to hear the journey of the Winnipeg Community Foundation, hearing about the growth and the stories and the inclusion of rural Manitoba. I took away a few key things for myself moving forward around the agency breakfast, the Nourishing Minds programs, working with the cities, and much more. So thank you. You know that we're firm believers that the root of any community impact actually starts with a story. It's including the people, the passion, and the dedication towards the needs of a community. Our purpose today is similar to what it was when we were founded in 1969, to have a predictable, stable, ongoing funding for the community forever. With the seeds of an original gift of $60,000 from the community chest, our foundation has grown its assets to more than $92 million. In the 51 years we've grown exponentially and have been able to return more than $50 million back to community for community need. We'll never lose sight of our roots, and we'll always treasure our partnerships so that together we can amplify community impact forever. I want to say thank you to everybody who's joined us today and those that are listening. As our truly respected donors and partners, your excellent work has helped us to do so many things for community together. Last week, as Gina mentioned, we learned the passing of Murray Grant, a founding member of this foundation. I was so fortunate to get to know Murray and meet him several times. I had the privilege of learning the history of the foundation from him during our 50th anniversary. He always spoke very thoughtfully about the people in the community who were passionate, who were generous, and who were kind. Many of these individuals became board members, donors, advisors, and even staff members after they retired from their first job. They were making a difference and they wanted to stay connected. Over the years, we've been privileged to partner with so many donors and community leaders. We're proud of the many legacies that have already been established. The list is quite extensive. These include a variety of initiatives that are at the heart and soul of southern Saskatchewan, from bigger projects like helping to build Mosaic Stadium, to smaller projects like providing money for milk programs in schools in Moose Jaw. Donors have contributed to thousands of programs over the 51 years to causes like senior activity programs and transportation for the disabled in places like Mooseman, delivering meals to people in isolation during COVID, exactly 1,648 in Swift Current by the Canadian Mental Health Association. Self-esteem and healthy relationship workshops in Langenburg and Churchbridge schools for young women through Shelwyn House in Yorkton. Virtual mentor programs for youth right across South Saskatchewan. Mural visual reconciliation projects in Southeast Cornerstone High School. Reading equipment for the visually impaired. And after-school programming at North Central Family Services, amongst thousands of others. With all these and many more initiatives, each contributes to building our community. While we reflect on the accomplishments, we also help to address the local emergent needs with any discretionary funding we have. And Rick talked briefly about the need for discretionary funding. We meet with community leaders, we convene with community partners like our Vital Signs Community Network, and we conduct research through our Vital Signs report to understand those pressing needs. In 2019, we used discretionary funding to provide seed money for 50 vital community conversations right across South Saskatchewan. People came together and talked about what was important to their community. Then the pandemic took place. In 2021, we went back after 1 year of COVID and revisited those 48 organizations and more and asked them to tell us how COVID had affected their community. Our recent report, called COVID-19 and Beyond, speaks boldly to the new leading issue of concern: the mental health needs of our public, the need for unrestricted funding for organizations to survive, and the vital need for charities to continue to support the well-being of the community. We pride ourselves on being able to respond quickly and immediate and being receptive to all kinds of ideas. With COVID, everybody was scared. having to isolate, stay home. Many people in our community didn't have access to food, shelter, or emergent supplies. We rallied to establish our emergency response fund for community need. Because we had discretionary dollars, because we had a generous bequest left to us, we were in a position to respond and did so quickly. The board immediately put forward a $500,000 matching donation. Other donors gave what they could. From $50 to $50,000, we needed every penny. Together we raised $1.2 million in 4 weeks, and we had it out the door in 8 weeks. We were able to be nimble and act quickly. In closing, our model represents foresight and longevity. We, South Saskatchewan Community Foundation, with you and your support, contribute to the needs of today while continuing to remain a reliable source for the needs of generations yet to come. The work we've been able to do so far with our donors, our charities, and communities has amplified community impact forever. We want to do more right across South Saskatchewan. We are local, we understand and work to understand our community, and we care. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. And thank you for the leadership that you bring to the foundation. We are delighted to have you, and the work that you're doing to, to ensure that initiatives like the Response Fund and whatnot are able to take shape is phenomenal. So thank you for your delivery and everything that you're doing with the foundation. So now we are going to join Donna and Rick for a kind of a virtual armchair conversation.
Thanks, Gina. With virtual, things change a little bit, so I'm not sitting in a chair ready to chat with you. But I do have a few questions, Rick, that I wanted to ask and wanted to start the conversation. I really appreciated the information that you shared earlier. And I do believe that people think of a community foundation maybe not so much as a charity, but they think it's something that they have to start their own fund or have large amounts of dollars or resources to start something and make a difference in community. You've shared with us a couple of examples of why that's not the case, that a community foundation is a charity, and there are ways that you can start something or donate to something and still make a difference. I wonder if you could just expand a little bit on that, and maybe if you had any other examples where something started small and really ended up having much more impact than you would have ever thought.
I can certainly give you other examples. I'm going to choose the Manitoba Heritage Trust Program. And I choose that because it is our 100th anniversary. And that coming up a number of years ago, we started asking ourselves about heritage and how could we support small museums. And so we created this program called the Manitoba Heritage Trust Program in partnership with the province of Manitoba. And the idea was to get small museums and archives to start to build some endowments for themselves. So if you went back 3 years ago, we would have had 0 endowments in this area. Today we have 58 funds. They are representative of museums, small museums, really right across Manitoba. I would say of the total 58, there's probably 5 or 6 in Winnipeg, and all the rest are outside of Winnipeg, in small communities right across our province. And the idea was to try to say, let's build some endowments here. And this is a perfect example of the $100 gift strategy of, a lot of people putting in a little bit of money and trying to build. Basically, you're planting a tree and trying to get it to grow. And we had varying success. Some of these funds now we're 3.5 years in. So some of the funds are probably generating $500 a year. And the larger, more successful ones are generating something like $12,000 to $15,000 a year. So it gives you a sense of sort of the scale of these funds. But even $500 for a small museum is a lot of money. And in Manitoba, this isn't critical of the government, but the reality is government grants for small museums have not been increasing very much over the last 20 years or more. So this strategy of working with the government to say, let's put something in place that helps the community help themselves would be an example of, as I say, we created 58 endowments in the last 3.5 years. They're right across our entire province, most of them outside of Winnipeg. There's certainly, I don't know how many millions of dollars would be in those funds now, but certainly, perhaps $4 million cumulatively across all of them, with varying degrees of success in different communities. We've had the blessing of a matching formula from the province, the way we structured the deal. And that will be there forever because it's an ongoing matching formula that'll generate about $180,000 a year matching dollars from now until forever. So it's an interesting strategy, I think. Heritage wouldn't necessarily be the one that Saskatchewan would choose. You might say, well, that doesn't really relate to our situation, but it's an example of how communities can come together. You don't have to be a city. You can be quite a small community and have a little museum or a little archives that you're very proud of. And the net result of that is people working together with some structure. And again, this is where the South Saskatchewan Community Foundation is so important, because you can create the structure, the investment structure. How do you set up a fund? Those are the things that make the difference.
Rick. Thanks so much, Rick. Yes, I read about that fund on your website about 1.5 years ago and found it quite interesting how it works to support all the museums across Manitoba. So I have another question here that I'd like to ask. It's important that community foundations are able to respond to community need like we did during the pandemic. And, I think Winnipeg was quite innovative in the way how they were very flexible and responsive to the needs of charities. I wonder if you could just share a little bit more about this trust-based philanthropy approach that you took towards getting money back out into community fast.
Well, Winnipeg is in a position to do a lot of grant making. Obviously, we have a lot of relationships. We make grants into 1,000 organizations every year, so we know the community pretty well. And so it was not difficult for us to make a trust-based decision to say, we know this organization, we're giving it money without application. So when COVID hit, there's no question that we put out quite a number of grants into the community without application. We simply called people up and said, we are depositing money into your account. And some of those were fairly modest, like personal care homes. I think the grants were like $5,000, so they weren't huge, but basically saying, here's $5,000, we know you're going to need it. In the case of Winnipeg Harvest, which is the food bank, the grants were much larger, $100,000 type grants. I mentioned Nourishing Potential as one of my favorite little projects that we've worked on. And we I think did $10,000 grants to 20 organizations. We called 20 youth serving organizations up and said, we're putting $10,000 into your account. So it's just, we've had these long relationships. We know organizations as the South Saskatchewan you'll know your own charitable sector, and the need is there. I remember when the Youth and Philanthropy program started in Winnipeg back in 1997, 1998. There was a lot of questions amongst people like, how can you trust young people in high school to give away money? And because we were giving them, our youth and philanthropy committees were getting $5,000 each to give away at their discretion. And there was a lot of concern about that. But today with, the youth and philanthropy committees in Winnipeg have given out certainly well in excess of $1 million. And I can't remember a single grant that the youth and philanthropy committees ever made that anybody would second guess. I think the charitable sector is, by and large, very trustworthy. People are very passionate. They get the best bang out of every dollar they spend. And I feel that, and our board supported this idea of we know organizations need money, let's get money into their hands.
Rick. One last question for you. And because South Saskatchewan is hoping to get more involved in our rural communities, I'd like to know why you believe that the Endow Manitoba Giving was such a success. Hopefully I'm going to learn a little bit more about it in the future, but I'd like to know why you feel it was such a success.
Well, people want to give to their own community. I mean, at the end, endowments are hard in the first place because, most people want to give money and they want it to have an impact like immediately, tomorrow morning. What are you doing for me? And endowments, you're already giving into an investment pool that's going to generate income for the long run. So it's a unique strategy in many respects. It's about sustainable long-term funding. But if you're saying it's for my community, and it's going to be here to help people who live in my community for the long term, that has appeal. And again, it's you need ambassadors. Obviously, you need some donors. You need structure to put something like this together. And as I say, our situation, we started off pretty small. There were 24-hour challenge arrangements. And in 24 hours, the first year, as I say, I think we only generated a couple $100,000 across all of Manitoba, which is a big province, obviously. But now, pretty much every year, we're doing $1 million in that program every year that goes into discretionary funding. You mentioned discretionary funding. It's totally discretionary funding that goes to the benefit of communities right across our province.
Thanks so much, Rick. I'll turn it back over to Gina for a second.
Rick and Donna. And so now we're going to move into the next section of our presentation. And so Donna is going to speak a little bit with us about the future of the SSCF.
Yep, thanks. So while you're getting your questions in, I'm going to just share a few more words on the future. The Foundation is working to have a presence right across South Saskatchewan. COVID restrictions have taught us that we need to do things differently. We hope to include more charities from rural Saskatchewan in our Vital Signs Community Network in the future, and any opportunities that we're able to offer to our Vital Signs Community Network. We hope to reach out to rural communities and talk about their futures and work together to build their community portfolio for the next generation, the future. The world has brought to light some much needed changes in society. More focus needs to be placed on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've started down a path to learn more and grow in a better way for today and the future. Recently, we were all saddened to learn about the dark history of Canada with our Indigenous people. As a community foundation, our mandate is really to improve the quality of community well-being right where you live. That includes all of our members. The South Saskatchewan Community Board and staff are learning and looking to educate ourselves on what we can do differently, how we can change our culture, our policies, and make room for all of our members for a better tomorrow. The board has committed resources towards the area of truth and reconciliation, supporting our Indigenous communities and Indigenous-led organizations. In addressing our future, amplifying community impact forever, we will look to our community donors, volunteers, community leaders, and charities to join us on this journey of learning and supporting a better future for everyone in South Saskatchewan. It is only together that we can build a community for generations yet to come. Thank you.